Alright, so in this video I'm going to briefly describe how autism is transmitted from one person to another. Before I do that, I want to ask if you're able to please support my channel, please support my work. This answer of what autism is originates with me. I'm the one who's been putting it out there for 2 years. Visit my patreon.com/midnightbastard page and you'll see it. Read the article, it's clearly stated. So I've noticed some people now trying to lift my work on YouTube, and they don't know all the details, they don't know all the nuances, they don't have all the proper answers, and they're already misleading others into thinking that autism is strictly a product of narcissism. And that is not the case. That is not the case at all. So I want you to understand how this really functions, and I'm going to be describing in great detail. Once we're done with autism, I'm going to be describing in great detail how narcissism works, how psychopathy works, how schizophrenia functions, all of those. I'm going to be describing those feedback loops too. And you'll see how any one of those things can provoke autism. And it is also the case that a person would not have to be ill to provoke autism in another. So I want you to understand that, and that you're getting misinformation from this other person who is just lifting my work. So if you want to support the person who is bringing you this answer, who is actually responsible, please visit my Patreon, patreon.com/midnightbastard. So with that being said, I'm going to cover the setup here of what we're doing, and I'm also going to explain the different variables. So what we have is person A and person B. Person A would be the adult, or a very influential person, and person B would be the person subjected to person A's influence. And that means influence and control, effective influence and control for a prolonged period of time. So for example, if you're next to a person that is autistic, you're not going to catch autism. If you're next to someone who's schizophrenic, you're not going to catch schizophrenia. So, but if you have prolonged exposure to this person, and you are vulnerable to them, you depend on them specifically, and they have control over your decisions, yes, you can get sick. And this is how that happens. So what we have to first identify is a symptomatic trait. So a symptomatic trait of autism, for example, is frequent correcting of others, which is being pedantic. So if you're pedantic and you're constantly correcting others, and I've already said this word a couple times and it's annoyed you, right? If I keep correcting you in your mistakes, in the things you do, in the way you approach them, and the things you're even trying, if I constantly correct you, this would be annoying, would it not? It would be extraordinarily irritating to any person. So if you are exposed to this day in and day out, these are natural consequences that might evolve from that. And you will notice that these consequences are in turn symptomatic traits of autism. And that just comes from being exposed to someone that's pedantic for too long. Indecision. You would become indecisive. So if you are constantly being told you're wrong and constantly being corrected, you're going to question your decisions. You're going to have reduced self-esteem if you get things wrong all the time. You're going to have to develop a sensitivity to correction. Notice these three things I've said are symptomatic traits of autism, and they're springing about from another symptomatic trait of autism. So sensitivity to correction, that means you're not open to other people's feedback. Why? Because the feedback you got at the start was always that you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. At some point you have to put your foot down and say, you know what, I don't even care if I'm wrong, I'm just done hearing it. I want to do things my way specifically and see what happens. Reduced self-confidence, reduced initiative, reduced motivation. So you're not going to feel motivated to do something when you're constantly getting things wrong. You're not going to feel the initiative to get started when you know it can end up bad. Stress and self-soothing. It's stressful to be exposed to frequent correction. And then this leads to self-soothing, which comes in the form of flapping, in the form of obsessions, in the form of pattern seeking. And I'll get into self-soothing a whole lot later in another video. Spotlight sensitivity. That means when you're called to action to perform, Well, you don't even want that. You want the smallest footprint possible, because when you get called to action, it leads to an eventual judgment in which you, by and large, tend to lose. There's an over-focus on your mistakes, and this would create all sorts of frustrations in the individual that I'll keep highlighting, and spotlight sensitivity is one of them. Another one is rumination on past failures. So if you're constantly being corrected, you're going to try to reconsider the things you've done in the past. And if you're just constantly seeing mistakes, all the mistakes that were pointed out by this other person, this would then become internalized. You're going to ruminate on this. This is going to create resentments. It's going to create grudges. It's going to create low self-esteem, low self-confidence, because you're constantly thinking on your mistakes. Rumination. So low morale. Obviously, you're going to have a low morale if you're constantly being told you're making mistakes. Avoidance. This is a big one. Well, before I hit avoidance, let's hit procrastination, because that goes to initiative. So it stands to reason, if you have a tendency to make mistakes and you know there's just no payoff, that you're going to procrastinate. You're going to put things off because you have a tendency, according to others, to get things wrong. Now let's hit avoidance. So there you go. Procrastination is an avoidance. But avoidance exhibits itself in other ways too. So if someone is frequently correcting you, you tend to not want to make eye contact with that person. Not only because you do not want to see their eyes, but excuse me, you do not want to see the expression that accompanies the disappointment, that you don't want to see the scowl, you don't want to see the sad face, you don't want to see the angry expression letting you know you did the thing wrong. So you'll avert your eyes. You'll not look up at them. And if you do this long enough, you'll be able to look at no one, because it will become a conditioned response that you do not make eye contact, especially when being judged, when you feel yourself subjected to the judgment of others. Fault sensitivity. This is a big one too. Oh, let me hit more on avoidance. Hold on, because avoidance has many parts. So you're going to avoid situations that potentially lead to judgment, that potentially lead to correction, that potentially then lead to a diminished self-esteem. You're gonna avoid all that. So you're going to avoid eye contact, but you're also not going to try to initiate conversations with this person. You don't want to make your presence known and insert yourself in a situation that you know tends not to work out for you. So you'll isolate yourself. Another mode of avoidance. And in addition to that, you'll pretend that you can't hear instructions, because the instructions, if it's a frequent correction, you don't want to hear it. If it's another instruction, you don't want to hear it. Whatever it is, you want to tune it out. So this factors into not being able to hear things, mutism, and to not making eye contact. Fault sensitivity. So what is fault sensitivity? Fault sensitivity is basically where you're looking for mistakes before you turn your work in. So if you become accustomed to constantly being corrected and you don't want that frustration and stress, well then you'll look over your work again and again and again, finding faults. And over time, you'll become good at it. And this over time feeds into perfectionism and feeds into pattern seeking, that then feeds into a person becoming savant at one thing or another. Then that plays into the self-soothing as well. So I'm going to, in another video, I'll explain how autistic people become savants. Hyper or self-reliance. You're going to have diminished self-reliance, obviously, if you're constantly being corrected. You're going to say, hey, listen, I tend to get things wrong. Can you just do that for me? Tantrums. If you're frequently being corrected, it tends to be the case that people that frequently correct might not let you have your own say in things. So if you grow frustrated over time and they just will not listen, and the one thing that they listen to is to you just having an outburst. And then if they have sensory sensitivity, so that you can see how these things feed into each other. If they have a sensory sensitivity and you have this outburst and they can't take it, they might give in, which then reinforces the habit of, well, when I need things done, I have to tantrum to get them. That's the only time I'm listened to. So your ability to assert yourself would become compromised as well. Think about it. If you're constantly being corrected and something needs to be done, you're not going to be the one to say, hey guys, I know how to do this wrong. You're not going to be that person. You're going to stand in the sidelines. You're going to stand back. You're not going to assert yourself. You're going to lie. You're going to cover your mistakes. If you don't want to feel that way, if you don't want to be corrected again, you're going to be more prone to lying. Conflict aversion. I'm not sure conflict aversion should be here. Maybe it should, and I just can't think of the connection immediately, so I won't touch on it. Self-consciousness. You're going to become more self-conscious. If you're constantly being told you're making mistakes, if your self-esteem is suffering, if you have all this indecision, you see how all of these feed into each other, by the way? All of these different symptomatic traits that are developing in person B, which in this case we'll say it's a child, they're feeding into each other as well. For example, reduced self-esteem feeds into indecision. Indecision feeds into reduced self-esteem. So all of these things feed into each other as well. So you get a huge feedback loop forming over time. And this is all stemming from the person being pedantic. You see how I haven't even covered the other ones, and already so many things are snowballing that can then, that person wouldn't even need to contribute anything else. It's like the person developing the autism would say, like, I got it from here. I'll make myself worse. Because that's what tends to happen over time. Your reward seeking would be diminished. If you know you have a tendency to get things wrong and you don't want to deal with all the consequences of that happening, well, your tendency to seek out rewards will be diminished. Now we're going to hit finally a second trait. So another symptomatic trait that could provoke autism in a person is if someone is risk averse. Let's say that someone, whatever condition they have, they are prone to risk aversion, meaning that they overestimate risks and they won't even attempt, let's say, trivial tasks. Now this would function on a spectrum with autistic people, obviously. Some would be more risk averse than others. But let's say this person is risk averse, so they don't have a good measure of potential outcomes of potential actions, meaning that their view of risk is disproportionate from whatever reality has to offer for the most part. So if a kid is being exposed to that advice, they're going to be told you're going to fall down, you're going to get hurt, don't try that, this is going to have that consequence. They're going to constantly be fed fear. And the child will notice over time that this, well, I don't want to get into it. Let me go through the list because then this video will get too long. So if the person is risk averse, the child can overestimate their risks because the person who is informing them, who they should be able to count on, who they want to, is just feeding them bad information. They'll develop low self-esteem. They'll be the person left out, not attempting tasks that anyone in their peer group seems to be able to do with no problem. They're going to suffer issues of confidence as a result. They're going to internalize this sense of fragility. For example, if you're a 7-year-old at some monkey bars and your parents looking after you, and there's like 10 preschoolers jumping up and down all over the place and getting hurt and getting up and doing just fine, well, that's one, it's going to create an impression of them. So it's going to create this external sense of fragility where other people say, wow, that person probably just can't do that. They probably would get hurt. They're probably scared. They're probably just don't know how to do it in the first place. And at the same time, that would become internalized. It's, oh, wow, all of these people seem to be able to do that. Wow, they're a lot younger than I am. Wow, where are their parents? They're not here. So all of those fears and sense of I can't do this, that just becomes what the person comes to believe in themselves, and they create these artificial ceilings. So if you're risk averse, you'll also want to isolate yourself to diminish risk. If you're not exposed to danger, how would you be in danger, right? So, although there are hidden dangers of isolation, which I'll touch on. So, it creates the illusion, though, the useful illusion of avoiding risk. Isolation does. Low exploration. You'll be less prone to explore your environment if you're perceiving risks left and right. That stands to reason. And if you don't explore your spaces, well, what are the consequences? 1, you don't know how to move in them. 2, you don't know what to do. What is B and C and D to whatever the A was that you never attempted? you never get to develop different patterns. You don't get to interact with others. So low exploration has a shit ton of consequences, and they come from risk aversion. And notice again how all of these symptomatic traits that are developing feed into each other. So that if the person that the child is exposed to is merely risk averse and nothing else, it could be enough. If the risk aversion is exemplified in a heightened manner, it could be enough to trigger an autism cycle in the child all by itself. So it does not require this wild narcissism hate that this other person on YouTube is trying to push out there. So be careful. Okay, let me see where else I am on the list. So low explorations, sensory sensitivities. So if you're not exploring things, you're not exploring your flavors, you're not exploring your foods, of course that affects your diet. You're not exploring your ways to do things, and you're sticking to the patterns that are safest. That is rigidity, by the way. You see how that fed into rigidity? I had to explain that one first to make this one make sense. So if you're rigid in your routines and you're not getting out there because you're risk averse, well, it stands to reason you're going to develop all sorts of sensory issues. You're not going to expose yourself. You're not going to expose not just yourself, but your senses. And your senses, when you expose them to, for example, you go out for a snow fight. Let's say you're scared of getting in a snow fight altogether, so you don't go out in the snow. But had you not been scared of having the snow fight, you would have dealt with the cold. Your senses would have been exposed over time. You would have gotten used to it. It wouldn't be where a 70-degree day feels incredibly awfully cold, because you are not exposing your senses through your isolation, through your risk aversion, through this stepping back and not engaging in the world. You are, in effect, yes, you do have sensory issues. They're not make-believe, but it's a simple function of not that you're born with this mutant X gene that has you detecting all these sensations in the world. It's that they never calloused because you never put them to use. So sensory sensitivities, rigidity, I said that, but going back to it, if you're risk averse, you're going to stick with the safest patterns. You're going to stick with what works, with what doesn't bring stress, with what doesn't bring problems. Fault sensitivity. So fault sensitivities is you're looking for the mistakes in your environment. This creates hypervigilance too. So you're constantly looking at what can go wrong, what is the obstacle, what is the obstacle after that obstacle. And you're only focusing on every bad thing that could potentially probably happen, and your ability to estimate risk in the first place is already compromised. So you know that's going to be exaggerated. So you're going to be hypervigilant, and you're going to be risk averse, and you're going to be overestimating risk, and you're going to create problems all over the place. So eventually you'll come to catastrophize. Conflict aversion. So if you're risk averse, you know that confronting anyone on any issue carries one risk or another. It carries some level of risk. So if you're risk averse and you avoid others, well, what happens if you avoid conflict? Well, you don't learn how to engage in conflict resolution. Most conflicts don't lead to duels. Most people figure their issues out. But if you avoid conflict in the first place, things can then snowball because you don't nip things in the bud, so that when they do get really nasty, well, then now you're stuck and then you're left to run away. Hypervigilance, I mentioned that one. Self-consciousness. If you're risk averse, you're going to feel different from your peers. They're taking risks that you're not. You're going to be self-conscious. You're the one left out. Everybody's jumping in the pool. All the other kids are climbing the tree. Some other kid threw himself to the slide. You're standing to the side of it. Think of how this would make you feel over time. You're going to be extremely self-conscious about it. Low reward seeking. This one is kind of self-explanatory. I mean, if you are prone to being risk averse, you're not going to take risks, even if they lead to rewards, because big rewards take big risks, don't they? So if you are prone to avoiding risk, you are prone to not seeking goals out. Low morale, that explains itself, and I kind of touched on the diet, so I'll move on to the next thing. So just with those two symptomatic traits alone, you could see all the other symptomatic traits that could develop. And hopefully you also see how they are connected to each other. So I'm going to be posting this on Reddit, by the way, and you'll be able to see all the different connections. And I'm going to give you a picture here. Take a look right here. So this is just, let's see if this camera can catch that. So this is a partial list. So this, of course, here, this is not all of it. This would go into dozens and dozens of variables off of any symptomatic trait. But obviously, we're already at the 20-minute mark, and I've only covered two symptomatic traits and what they could lead to, all the symptomatic traits that can develop. And I said I was going to do 6. So think about that. If you can get all of that from just those two traits alone, from being overexposed to them, put that into context. Excuse me. Emotional dysregulation. So if you're constantly being told what to do and you're constantly told you're doing it wrong, you're being frequently corrected, if you're being fed all these fears of risk aversion, it's going to provoke all sorts of emotions in you, right? But if the person you're dealing with is emotionally dysregulated, which most autistic people tend to be, well then they're not going to be able to provide you the best answers, because autistic people have issues with labeling their feelings, with dealing with their feelings, with controlling the flow of their feelings, with having feelings, period. So it is, again, that functions on a spectrum. So some people will be more affected than others. But if you're a child and you're exposed to someone who's deeply affected with their emotional dysregulation, they can't control their feelings, they can't control their outbursts, they can't make sense of their emotions and their context, then obviously this person is not going to be able to help you out very much. So if you come to them with your own feelings, they could tell you, well, no, you don't feel that, or you feel something that you're not supposed to be feeling, or you're not supposed to be feeling anything at all. Or they can redirect your understanding of the way you feel and create all sorts of confusion and further frustration and further stress that can then do all sorts of things. It can lead to you mislabeling your own feelings, a reduced sense of patience. You're not able to manage your feelings well. You're not able to contextualize them because you're getting advice not only from a non-expert, you're getting advice from someone who has their own ability to assess their feelings deeply compromised. So this is the person who's informing you on the way you feel when you're learning what feelings are and how to deal with them. Empathy sensitivity. So what does that mean? Empathy and sensitivity is when your emotions are invalidated for so long, for whatever reason, that whenever anyone validates them in the slightest way, you become overwhelmed. Like somebody finally is on my side, and then you just start crying and all this frustration comes out. So that tends to happen with autistic people too. Low affect. Now, there's some studies out there that indicate this, that when you reduce your expression, when you put your face, when you smile, you feel more happy. When you put a frown, you can and then feel bad. So this is a mutual causal process. One provokes the other. You can feel good and smile, or you can smile and provoke yourself to feel good. So autistic children that develop autism, intuitively get a sense of this over time. And they sense that when I put my face with no feelings, I'm able more easily to manage them because I'm not further feeding into that cycle. They're obviously not articulating it that way. No one ever is, but this is the intuitive sense they gain of things, and this is how low affect starts to develop. Dampening. Dampening is one of these things of not dealing with feelings, and I'll get into that in another video by itself. And that's going to be a big one in the psychopathy video, by the way. Empathy bombardment. What is empathy bombardment? So once you become sensitive to people's empathy, it stands to reason that they can bombard you with empathy. So if you get overwhelmed when someone validates your feelings, and then you have a perception of something that happened, let's say you had a kite, all right? You had a kite, you were flying it, it fell to the ground, and someone said, oh, I'm sorry that fell. That could completely overwhelm you, believe it or not. The empathy bombardment. Neoteny, so emotional dysregulation, you hang on to things that comfort you, you're not socializing, you're exposed to things from when you're youthful, so you hang on to them. These are the things that provide you comfort, and they promote this neoteny in the person. Trust issues. You're not going to trust the person who is telling you your feelings aren't what they are. You're going to develop trust issues with them and with others. Sense of safety is going to be diminished. Your avoidance. Let's get into the avoidance. So, again, you're going to want to avoid people who make you feel a certain way. You're going to, and depending on the strategies you employ, and the things that little kids can do are minimal, so they can avoid eye contact. That's the least thing they can do. They can avoid speaking up. They can avoid having to listen. They can just isolate themselves in the house. They can distract themselves with some pattern or something. So they're basically dealing with the stress in the best way that they can. It's not like they're sitting down analyzing things. They're making mistakes after mistakes because they're being put in these situations. So if you learn to avoid, you'll learn to avoid eye contact over time. You don't make eye contact with anyone. You learn not to listen. Someone can be saying something important and you'll completely tune them out. And this goes to incidental neglect that can happen. So you can hear something important and be completely caught up in the thing that you're doing and incidentally provoke a stressful situation or give way to it in a way that you would have obviously tended to, because you would have cared. If this distraction had not been in front of you, if this tuning out had not been a factor, and you had seen your kid crying in a corner, you would have gotten up. But this thing is affecting you. So that's why I want to point it out that this person who's saying it's all narcissistic parents, they really need to stop. They really need to stop. Stop lifting my work. Sit back and listen, and stop saying erratic things. You yourself are being a little narcissistic at the moment. Anxiety. It stands to reason that emotional dysregulation, you're going to have anxiety issues. The way in which you approach things, especially if you have trust issues as well, if your sense of safety is compromised, if you're avoiding things, if you isolate yourself, if you're emotionally dysregulated, one, others are going to want to stay away from you, and two, you're going to want to stay away from others because maybe it just gets more stressful when you're with them. So this mutual causal factors feed into each other, and the person, as a function of becoming emotionally dysregulated, isolates themselves. Hypervigilance. So if you're emotionally dysregulated and you can point at the things that make you feel that way, that make you feel a certain way, and it's a bad way, then you'll become hypervigilant to those things. You'll be on the lookout. You'll be on the lookout for the thing that could happen next. Self-consciousness. Obviously, you're going to be very self-aware of all these things you're feeling. And because they're not able to be resolved, because you're emotionally dysregulated, they'll be present for a lot longer because they will not be settled. So then that leads to all sorts of problems. Like, for example, I'm sorry, I kind of lost my thought because I looked at something here. So that could lead to all sorts of problems if you're not able. I forgot what I said, so I'm just gonna wing it. If you're not able to properly assess the thing you're feeling and you're avoiding your emotions, you're going to isolate yourself. You're going to become vigilant. Your self-consciousness is going to become elevated over time if you're constantly caught looking in. So this creates self-absorption. This hits on that narcissistic line that starts at self-absorption, because necessarily as a defensive mechanism, you're caught so many times looking in that it becomes a habit not to look out. And it then becomes second nature to ignore things you should be paying attention to, because you're not even ignoring things. It's just, this is where you learn to keep your focus on, to keep it a constant self-assessment. So, and self-consciousness leads to all sorts of problems that I'll touch on in another video. Low reward seeking. If you're emotionally dysregulated, you don't want to take the risks that might produce more emotional dysregulation. That stands to reason. So this would then, of course, lead to reduced risk taking. So you see how that feeds into it. All of these things feed into each other. I was thinking of building a master loop, but it would involve hundreds and hundreds of variables, and they would not apply to everyone. So not all of these variables would apply to every case, but it gives you the setup of how it happens. It applies to all cases, but not every case, if that makes sense. So the principle applies across the board, but the specific variables will be different from person to person to person. So, low reward seeking, hyperactivity. You're emotionally dysregulated. You can't control your excitement. You can't control your sense of boredom. You can't control whatever feeling you have that might lead into hyperactivity. Would obviously be fed if you have no control of your emotions, or if you have very little control of them. This would also feed into tantrums. If you have very little control, you're more likely to get worked up. You're more likely not to be able to regulate your emotions as they come about and go. You let them get pent up over time until eventually you just explode. Rumination. If you're emotionally dysregulated and you're constantly feeling bad, you're going to remember all the thoughts that made you feel bad before. This would reinforce the rumination. This would reinforce your ability to recall and your improved memory, because you're constantly recalling things. Same thing with pattern seeking. We'll get into memory in another video. And with that being said, I'm going to hit on, wow, there's still 3 more. So as you see with that, I'm already 32 minutes in. I thought this video was going to be shorter, but I really want to elaborate on some of these. So it's going to be as long as it is. Micromanaging is one of those things that autistic people have a tendency to do. But not only autistic people, obviously. There's all sorts of people that have a tendency to micromanage. So just consider what might happen if you're exposed as a child to someone who has a real high tendency to micromanage. Never mind as an adult. If you're an adult, a teenager, a kid, and you've dealt with people like this, you know it is hard. You know it is stressful, even in especially in confined spaces, but even in limited time chunks. So you could just go to work or from one school period and be exposed to a particular teacher who wants things done one way. You know how stressful that is. So imagine if you have to live with someone who is chronically predisposed to doing this, to constantly micromanaging your actions, constantly directing you to everything you do. What might be some of the symptomatic traits that might develop in you as a defensive response to them? Let's look at them. So 1, your sense, this is not a defensive response, this is just a consequence. Your sense of autonomy would be diminished. If someone is constantly telling you what to do, well then you're like, I have no control here. I don't really have say. I have to listen. Your stress would be off the charts, which would lead to self-soothing, which we'll explore in another video. Your sense of self-direction would be diminished. Your self-reliance. If you know that you are not allowed to do things as you wish in your own way, then you're going to rely less on your own opinions, on your own ideas, on your own actions. You're going to seek out others. This will, of course, lead to diminished confidence, diminished self-esteem, diminished assertiveness. How are you asserting yourself? You're being told what to do again and again and again. And let's think clearly here. What would happen with that type of person if you're a child and they're frequently telling you what to do? Can you really object? Can you really say no? If you are not the one that does this, that does not say no, well, that's going to necessarily affect your level of assertiveness. Though, if you do confront it, your assertiveness can go off the charts. So we'll hit all the different variables that can happen. Initiative and motivation is going to be damaged through micromanaging. So You're going to be told what to do. You're going to be told how to do it. You're not going to feel good about it. Your emotions are going to get dismissed either way. You're going to be corrected in your mistakes. You're not going to want to take the risks that might lead to a correction. So all of this feeds into this low assertiveness, this low initiative, this low motivation, this mixed emotions, this avoidance. Again, avoidance. You're going to want to avoid contact with the person who is micromanaging you. You're going to want to avoid looking them in the eye. You're going to want to avoid initiating conversations with them. You're going to isolate yourself away from them. You're going to pretend that you can't listen to that new added instruction that followed the 1-2 seconds right before it. So this feeds into that procrastination. You're going to put off the things in which you're going to be micromanaged on. Isolation. You're going to isolate yourself away from the things which you will be micromanaged on. Low exploration. If you are being told how to do things, you can't figure out other ways to do things. You're not being allowed to explore other potential efficiencies, other potential outcomes. You just won't know because you are being consistently guided. Anxiety, of course, this would lead to that. Self-consciousness. Low reward seeking. So if you're constantly being told what to do, then and you have low autonomy, you're really not the one that's seeking out these ideas and putting your own plans into effect. So your reward seeking diminishes over time. Hyperactivity. If you're constantly being told what to do and you can't do things your way, you're going to be a bundle of frustrated energy. And that will come out through hyperactivity. Tantrums. If you finally realize that, oh my God, I got to stop all these instructions, and the only way I can get through is through an outburst, well, then that's what's going to happen. Resistance and non-cooperation. This goes into what Gregory Bateson called systems of holding back. And that's basically where you no longer want to cooperate. This becomes the kid that doesn't want to put the shirt on, the kid that doesn't want to eat the food. It's a defense mechanism. It's I can't take this. I'm not going to go along with this any longer. That's what that's about. So with that said, I'm going to cover the last two, and then I'll close this video. The next one is isolation. So if you are stuck with someone who has a tendency to isolate themselves, as many autistic people tend to do, and of course, again, that's on a spectrum, so some people will isolate themselves more than others. But if you are stuck with someone who isolates themselves a lot, and that's not mediated by going out with another adult or something, well, then you're stuck there right with them, which means that you're exposed to whatever other symptomatic traits they might have for a more prolonged period of time, which then can cause more problems in you. But at the same time, other problems can develop from the isolation. For example, a kid that gets isolated for whatever reason, well, they have diminished social contact. If you have diminished social contact, you have diminished social fluency. You're not interacting with others. You're not learning things. You're not learning conflict resolution. You're not learning what feelings mean. You're not learning how to label your emotions and consider the emotions of others, because you are emotionally dysregulated. So this would, of course, going back to that, create issues of empathy with you, so that when you deal with others, you become more dismissive of the way they feel. So low social influence as well, low social status. You're not the one calling shots if you're the one isolated, if you're the one that can't even communicate properly, if you're the one that has a low social status. Reduced friendships. That's a consequence of all that. That's a consequence directly of isolation. Notice how all of these feed into each other, by the way. Never lose sight of that. It's all a feedback loop. Reduced networking opportunities. So you're meeting less people, you're dealing with less people, you're having less social interactions, you're in different situations, or rather you're not in different situations that could lead to new different situations. So it stands to reason that your opportunities to network with others for whatever reason are going to be diminished. which means that your social mobility is diminished. For example, if you don't have the connects, you can't land that job interview. You can't land those tickets. You can't visit that friend and get introduced to that other person that eventually you then might date. So there's all sorts of consequences that happen from isolation. Your sense of autonomy, if you're being isolated against your will because this other person needs to isolate themselves and you just never get out, well, your sense of control and say over yourself is necessarily diminished. So your sense of autonomy suffers. Stress and self-soothing. So naturally, it can get stressful to be isolated against your will for long enough over time. So you'll feel stressed, you'll feel frustrated. This will lead to self-soothing, to flapping, to pattern searching, to echolalia, which is another one. I'm going to get into all of these. So if you see it left out, if you say, hey, why didn't you touch on that? Are you not able to explain it? No, as you can see, this video is already running on 40 minutes, and I've only covered a couple dozen symptomatic traits and how they come about and reinforce each other. So it would take a long time. If you have a specific question, shoot it to me and I'll address it. So if you're isolated and you have low social contact and all of this, well, what do you have contact with? With media, with TV, with movies, with video games. So this then becomes your mode of learning how to socialize with others to the extent that it's useful. So you'll borrow routines from TV and you'll implement them with others, not realizing that that's not exactly how things are done. So you'll make these social faux pas that will bring with them consequences. Others will then see you as strange. You will experience a diminishment in social status that can then reinforce the isolation. So this would also, of course, lead to self-absorption. So if you're constantly all about you, if you're constantly isolated and having to deal with yourself exclusively, whether you want to or not, well, this is going to elevate your self-absorption. And that is a huge problem over time if it gets out of control. If it steps into the narcissism realm, it can get real brutal. And I'm going to detail narcissism, and again, I don't know if I mentioned it, but narcissism is recoverable from. You can recover from being a narcissist. I'll explain it when we hit that loop. Rumination. So if you're isolated, well, you have nothing more than time to think, right? So you're thinking, and if your tendency is to be emotionally dysregulated because of all the stress, well, you're going to think about the things that feel bad to you. And you're going to recall them with great precision because you'll be recalling them again and again and again. And your autobiographical memory and ability to recall will be enforced over time. But the things you're thinking of are negative, so that when you have next encounters with people, you remember the things that went wrong with them before, and that sets the tone for the encounter. Kind of like when you have a dream and someone does something in the dream and you wake up mad at them and you know, hey, it's just a dream. But it's the same thing with memories. If you're constantly just feeding yourselves all the worst interactions, for example, it's like the internet. Isn't that what that law in Europe was about? Where the right to be forgotten, where a mistake would follow you? Well, the mistakes of others follow them through your memory too. So if you constantly have this mindset of this person did me wrong in this way, I remember this interaction, because you're constantly ruminating. One, you'll feel bad in front of them. You'll feel bad about them. You'll feel bad about your relationship. It cannot progress. It can lead to systems of holding back and also many problems. So I really want you guys to see that it's really not as simple as saying that it's narcissism. So to this other person, if you're acting with honesty, please step back and listen. Rumination, detachment from reality. If you're isolated and you're just caught in your head all the time, and you start constructing all these fantasy worlds and whatever, and you're just not dealing with the real world, period, it stands to reason that you're going to develop some degree of detachment from reality. That can get worse over time. Sensory sensitivities. Neoteny, by the way. Neoteny, this remaining juvenile. If you are not exposed to your peers, then you are not progressing with them. at the same rate they are, right? So their interests might shift in unison, or for the most part, where yours really lag behind. So this isolation can mess up the synchronicity between you and your peers. I don't know if I use synchronicity right there, because synchronicity is its own thing, but I was just trying to say sync up with your neighbors, just to correct that in case it's wrong. Sensory sensitivities. Again, if you're isolated, and there are studies that indicate this as being absolutely true, if you're keeping your kid isolated all the time, they develop allergies. They're not exposed to microorganisms that their bodies can kick the microorganisms as if it gets a chance to actually deal with it at some point, versus where the person's immune system the person grows up and it just got used to nothing. So now they're sensitive to all sorts of things as a simple function of being isolated. Same thing like with the cold. If you're not exposed to it, if you keep yourself isolated from weather extremes, well then guess what? You just can't deal with them. You're not a special person. Everybody else can deal with it. You have to detach yourself from this feeling that the condition makes you unique in a good way. There are good ways that it does that, but that's not one of them. Sensory sensitivities rather is not a good thing to experience unless you're able to detect something useful. If you're not able to function in your environment, then obviously it's an impediment. If you, however, don't touch a lot of things, don't do a lot of manual labor, and then your sense of tact is really sensitive, and that's useful for something, then obviously that's a virtuous cycle that developed incidentally of the vicious cycles that were unfolding themselves. Reduced social mobility. I think I hit on that one. So it stands to reason that your mobility would suffer if you're isolated. Self-consciousness would go off the charts. And finally, closing with the last one, it's rigidity. So rigidity is following routines. And I'm going to make other videos explaining more symptoms. Don't worry about that if you didn't hear your symptom mentioned or a symptom you were concerned with. I'm going to touch on it. So rigidity, which is the following, the sticking to routines. Think about everything I've said so far. So you don't want to be corrected. That's going to feed into rigidity. You don't want to take risks. You're going to stay rigid. You're going to go with the patterns that keep you safe. You want not to be corrected. You're going to stick with the patterns that work. You're going to be hypervigilant, so you're going to be detecting patterns. You're going to be detecting errors. You're going to be detecting faults. And this is going to reinforce the perfectionism. When you become a perfectionist and your standards get too high, and then you encounter the thing that meets them, well, then you want to stick with it. So then you want to stick with that bowl that perfectly holds the food. You want to stick with that spoon that perfectly fits in your mouth and has this specific texture that doesn't annoy you. Because over time, the parent learns to cater to what become needs, to what are essentially needs that are learned over time and reinforced back and forth, mutual causal, from the parent to the child, from the child to the sibling. Everyone around is passing signals. And if that equilibrium is provoking these symptomatic responses in the person, then it stands to reason they're going to become autistic over time. It's a progressive process. It takes years. It doesn't happen overnight. You're not going to catch autism by standing next to an autistic person for a whole year in school. So please don't get into thinking anything like that. That being said, please support my channel. Please support my work. It originates with me, the theory and the answer to what autism is. I am the one that's bringing it to you. Look at patreon.com/midnightbastard. Look at my articles there. Look at, again, visit my Reddit. Look at my comments. You're going to see I've been saying this thing for 2 years now, and I've been spreading the word. And I've been spreading the word all over the place. So if you hear people misrepresenting my work or trying to take credit for it, call them out on it. And please support my work again. Patreon.com/midnightbastard. That's it.